Game of Thrones is dying, or maybe a lot of you would say it's been dead since the series finale back in 2019. And well, okay. But for many of us, this whole world is based on a book series written by George R. R. Martin, and because there's the general belief that the books would eventually offer us a better conclusion to the story than that of the TV show, there's always been this backdoor path to optimism. So when the show ended 5 years ago, we just needed to wait a little bit, and The Winds of Winter, the 6th book in the series, would be available and would offer us so much more satisfaction than that of the TV show had to offer. Sure, we'd still need to wait after we finished that book for the 7th book in the series, A Dream of Spring, to be released, but at least we'd have something in the meantime and something to be excited to look forward to in the future. But that was almost 6 years ago, and The Winds of Winter has still not come out. This could be especially devastating for those who began reading A Song of Ice and Fire all the way back in the mid-90s when the first book of Game of Thrones came out, and probably still pretty crushing for those fans who expected The Winds of Winter long before the TV show Game of Thrones concluded. Now, I disagree that lack of source material is the primary thing that derailed the writing of Game of Thrones, but not having the final books for a TV show adapting a book series certainly does not help. Just think back to 2011 and how long ago that really was. That's when Game of Thrones Season 1 premiered, and just shortly after this, A Dance with Dragons, which is the 5th and most recent entry to the series, that's when it was released. That means the entire Game of Thrones TV series, and at the time of this video, 2 seasons of House of the Dragon has already come out. And House of the Dragon, now that I've mentioned it, it's based on the Dying of the Dragon section of the world-building book Fire and Blood, which, FYI, is supposedly getting a sequel. So there's another book series that's not completed, I suppose, if you want to look at it that way. But The Dance of the Dragons takes place in its entirety in the first book, Fire and Blood. And if there's one good thing about House of the Dragon, it is adapting that completed source material, although that source material is far more thin and much less detailed than George R. R. Martin's other novels, which has given way to the show creators of House of the Dragon to make quite a few creative decisions that may or may not have landed with some of the fans. Plus there's writers' strikes and a bunch of financial decisions that have been made at the top of HBO's parent company that have been confirmed to have a dramatic impact on the creative process and production of Season 2 for House of the Dragon, which I think just really takes an additional toll on the outlook for the entire series, especially if you firmly believe the lack of source material is what hurt Game of Thrones, and then that definitely won't be the issue for this. Now you get corporate decisions on top of questionable writing choices that can alter what could have been for Season 2. That is just really not the gut punch the Game of Thrones franchise can afford with a fan base that has already good reason to be skeptical of how this IP is being handled. I think the statement Game of Thrones is dying is more of an umbrella covering many issues for both book fans and show fans alike. I can't tell you for sure this franchise will eventually dissolve into nothing, but I also can't in good faith say that you have good reason to believe that this franchise can't survive long term to see itself sitting beside a franchise like The Lord of the Rings. It never will. You see, A Song of Ice and Fire and Game of Thrones is not really in the same category. I know many will point to Rings of Power getting mixed responses from fans that would suggest that these franchises both come with some good and bad. And yeah, that's true, but the Rings of Power is a spin-off to a completed work. I know some have their opinions about the Hobbit trilogy movies as well, and it wasn't always favorable, but most agree that the Lord of the Rings movie trilogy is considered by many to be a great trilogy, and many calling it a masterpiece, and that is certainly not the case for Game of Thrones. But more than that, J.R.R. Tolkien finished his book series. The last definitive update from George R. R. Martin that we have received about his progress on The Winds of Winter is that he's maybe about 2/3 of the way completed, or roughly 1,100 manuscript pages after 14 years since the release of his last book. Look, I want to give you reason to be optimistic about A Song of Ice and Fire and the adaptations, I really do. But when we see less enthusiasm from the fans, or we have these concerns about the adaptations not quite meeting our expectations, I think stating that Game of Thrones is dying is not hyperbole in any way. It's a warning from a concerned fan, myself. This is my favorite book series, and by default, it's created a desire to see the TV adaptations do great as well. That hasn't always been the case, obviously. The Hobbit movie trilogy certainly did not make all Tolkien fans super happy, but they always had The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings novels to fall back on, and because those books are completed and they are near and dear to many fans, that franchise will live on no matter how many shows or movies come and go, and regardless of the quality of those shows. Star Wars still has its original trilogy, and nothing can take that away from them, and Star Wars fans will always be Star Wars fans if only for the original trilogy. I'm one of them. My point is, Game of Thrones isn't dead yet, but if we never receive a conclusion to A Song of Ice and Fire from George R. R. Martin, I don't see how an incomplete work can continue to survive based on world-building books and lore alone being spun into adaptations, all the while never having the original author's story completed. It'd be one thing if Game of Thrones ended in a way that seemed consistent with George, and he came out and said, yes, this is exactly what I was aiming for. But on the contrary, he's actually come out and stated that his books are going in a very different direction than the show, even if the show got a few of those general plot points correct. Anyway, I guess this is kind of a response to the lack of conversation or enthusiasm around Game of Thrones and A Song of Ice and Fire, and I don't mean to be all doom and gloom. After all, there is a new show coming out in this franchise called A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms. I'm really looking forward to it. Me and many I know are very excited for this new series set in Westeros. It will be adapting the Dunk and Egg novellas, which are a spin-off prequel series that take place long before the events of Game of Thrones, but after the events of House of the Dragon, and it's some of George R. R. Martin's very best writing. The only criticism of these stories that I would say is that currently, there are only 3, but George has suggested that he does wish to get more of these novellas written so that Dunk and Egg will have a satisfying conclusion, as the intention from George is to write the entirety of these characters' lives, which is very exciting, and I'm looking forward to George completing these stories, but he has stated that he will not continue writing the novellas until until he finishes The Winds of Winter. Damn it. I'm sorry, but yeah, HBO is adapting a book series from George R. R. Martin that at this time technically does not have George's definitive ending. Yeah, we're doing that again. But this video does end. This is it. This is the definitive ending of this video. So hopefully I didn't make everyone that watched to this point super depressed. Thank you for watching.